Today's episode is with Tom Adamski.
Name is kind of self-explanatory. You're creating different segments within your network, or different separated, isolated units. We know what segments we need. We have a PCI environment that needs to be completely isolated. We have prod, dev, and test. Usually it comes down to like figuring out the tooling that can validate your connectivity options. So I see a lot of customers going, I will keep my prod and dev completely separate. And then the next day there's some requirement that forces them to connect those. So in terms of creating network segmentation, I would say keep it as simple as you can. For security groups, you can be granular, but the DACLs and subnets, the granularity decreases. So we think about Zero Trust as like the set of tools and capabilities to help you be more granular with your controls. So if you're running out of capacity on the one firewall, it's very hard to add a second firewall.
What parameters do you use to decide that whether I should use native or third party? Is it more? Hi everyone, this is Purushottam and thanks for tuning into Scale to Zero podcast. Today's episode is with Tom Adamski. Tom is an AWS Principal Solutions Architect specializing in networking. He has over 15 years of experience building networks and security solutions across various industries, from telcos and ISPs to small startups. He has spent last 6 years helping AWS customers to build their network environment in the cloud. And in the spare time, he can be found hunting for waves to surf across, like around the California coast. So Tom, thank you so much for coming to the podcast. For our audience, do you want to start with like a brief intro about your journey?
Cool. Thanks for having me, Puru. Hello, everyone. Funnily enough, I started my degree is in economics, so it's not in tech. So I got a master's in economics, and then I worked a little bit in economics, but I found it a little bit boring. I think economics gets exciting once you get to advising politicians or advising the country level. When you're just starting, it's extremely boring. So I kind of switched into doing an internship in tech and IT. I landed in a startup in London that was doing it was a small internet service provider. And that's how I started my journey, and I learned everything on the job. I've done my Cisco certs, and I slowly was progressing through. And I found that there's a lot of similarities between economics and knowing economics, learning economics, and networking, because there's a lot of patterns, there's a lot of mechanisms, how things stitch together, how things work together. So that modeling side of economics was kind of useful in the networking journey. But that was probably 16-ish years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, the last 6.5 years now, I've been in AWS, and it's been super fun working with customers and helping them figure out the network architectures.
Nice. So it's a very different journey, right? Because most folks start with some hacking and or did some college in the computer science itself, and then they come to security or networking areas. But yeah, you have a very different journey. So
I think it shows you can switch between.
Yes.
Like the IT is quite accessible, and you can start at the kind of bottom, and I found it already more exciting than economics at that entry level. Like there was a lot more fun, and you could do a lot more interesting things. So yeah,
you can do a lot of experimentation, hands-on work, right, when you're starting in networking or security. So yeah. Absolutely.
And all the models are immediately applicable, right? So you're testing some pattern, some model, and it works. Whereas with economics, it's you can test you test models, but usually you keep only 2 variables. Everything else you kind of have to abstract, because otherwise models stop working. So it's very theoretical versus networking, especially being very practical.
Either it works or it doesn't work, and you try to figure out, right? So that's how you get your hands dirty and get started. Love that. So a question that we ask to all of our guests, and we get unique answers, is what does a day in your life look like? So what does a day in your life look like nowadays?
So working in AWS as a solution architect, I don't have dedicated customers. You can think about me more as a kind of overlay. So I'm a specialist in networking. My expertise area is networking. So whenever customers in any space, startups, medium-sized, really large enterprises, global customers, need help with designing their networks, and that spans a lot of different topics. With the networking area in AWS is, the traditional connectivity, like, setting up fiber from A to B, and then figuring out how your virtual private networks or
Hmm.
VPCs in the cloud are going to look like, how DNS is going to be set up. But then it goes beyond into application networking, so load
Hmm.
balancing and different communication patterns between your applications. And then finally, even network security, so deploying your network firewalls and control points in your environment, creating segmentations, all of that. So that's the topic area. And then I probably would spend like a big chunk of my time just working directly with
Hmm.
customers. So different customer problems and challenges. Some of it could be new customers coming in and they're trying to figure out, okay, what should I do? What are the best practices? Here are my requirements. Can you help me figure out how to deploy those requirements on AWS? Some other cases are customers that are already on AWS and they're growing and they need to figure out, okay, we're going beyond a certain
Right.
size and maybe the original solutions we deployed no longer apply and we need to figure out how to scale to a higher
Hmm.
level. Um, and then, so that's one big chunk, but then there's a lot of learning for me when I'm seeing so many customers and I get to have these discussions and see what the pain points are and see what they find
Hmm.
challenging. The other big part is then amplifying what I found out and what I feel like is useful knowledge for our customers. So whether it's writing blog posts, presenting in sessions, like the session right now as well. So that's something that is a good opportunity to share some of the learnings and best practices I've seen with customers.
Yeah. So I can see that I'm guessing you won't have many boring days, right? Because you're working with many customers with their unique challenges, and you are not also focusing on one type of customers. You are working across different types of customers, different domains, different stages of the company. So each bring unique set of challenges, right? So there is learning, and you are also using that platform to share your learnings with others as well. So yeah, that,
That's totally right. Yes, there's a big variety of different customer use cases and sizes and even services. So we like what I find very exciting, being in AWS is the speed of
mhm,
development. Like in my past companies, sometimes I found that we weren't launching new things fast enough for me to be excited about, oh, there's this new thing that we can now use to make our customers' life
mhm,
easier. With AWS, that happens a lot. And I think so for sometimes for customers, it's even scary because they're going, oh my God, there's so many things coming in. No. So the good news is we're not forcing customers to have to use every single
mhm.
service, but it's just having the option to like this constant development of adding new options and new things that could make your life easier. That is exciting.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. And today we are going to talk about like network segmentation and even the security appliances. Some of them you alluded to, right? So to get started, can you help our audience understand what is network segmentation, and if you can maybe simplify it a little bit so that even non-engineering audience can understand.
Yeah. So at high level, I would say the name is kind of self-explanatory. You're creating different segments within your network, or different separated, isolated
Hmm.
units. I think the analogy, and you can jump in if because I'm trying different analogies to figure out what's the best way to explain it. I like the analogy of a building
Hmm.
and water pipes. Like you have the warm water and the cold water.
Hmm.
It's still water. It's just different types of water, and you don't want to mix it anywhere else other than at the place where you as a user actually decide to mix those two types of water, usually at your tap. I guess if you live in UK, you have two separate taps for cold and hot water. So then it gets a little bit harder. So you only mix it in the sink
Hmm.
or in the bathtub. But you're controlling the place where you're going to be mixing these different flows. So you can think about the water pipe and cold water pipe as different network segments that are staying completely isolated, even though they're delivering something
Hmm.
similar. And then you're very in control on when you mix it. Or we can expand that analogy even to sewage
Hmm.
lines, right? So you also don't want to mix your sewage line with your water pipes, unless you get to like a treatment facility, which could be considered like a solution that's able to filter the sewage out, process the water, and then only the water goes back into the
Hmm.
system. So it's all about like creating the clear cut segmentation and then having the ability to control the way you're mixing those environments together. So even though, when we talk about network segmentation, we want to say isolated networks, but in reality, I see many customers where they have requirements that they need to mix or create connectivity between those different
Mm-hmm.
segments in their environments for some specific
Hmm.
reasons.
I like the analogy where you can easily understand, right, that the hot water is coming from a different tap and the cold water is from a different tap. So, a question that comes to my mind is, why should I do this? Like, is it needed? And at what point in or at what stage of my company should I think about network segmentation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've seen customers be successful without any network segmentation. So having just one large, really flat
Mm-hmm.
network and being able to connect all the environments and apply their security controls in a different place than in the network.
Mm.
So I would think about the network as your defense in depth layer, where it's not the be all and end all. Network is not the only thing you need to use to create like your control points. It can help you, but my advice would be to use it in a gentle fashion. So don't use it for like very granular
Mm.
controls. Use it for broader, like I have production and non-production environments that I want to separate, and the reasons there could be varied, right? It could be primarily could be I want to have different security requirements for these different environments, but at the same time I might have other requirements there as well that would drive me towards having separate networks.
Okay. So, um, so you said that even we can use the vanilla or minimum network setup. Then what benefit am I getting from the network segmentation? Is it around security? Is it operational excellence? Is it compliance? Like, what benefit do I get out of this, so that I should think about incorporating network
Yeah,
segmentation?
yeah. So I would say network segmentation is more of a tool that you implement segmentation, but the driver for you needing segmentation should come from really doing a risk assessment
Hmm.
or figuring out um, your data classification, and or if you have any compliance requirement to say PCI should never mix with your payment network should never mix with other networks. Those would be the drivers for you to then go, okay, I need to somehow apply these requirements into my environment, and then I need to like do it with the help of the network, but also with the help of other tools. Um, there's also some other benefits, like from a I often see customers create segments for production and non-production environments.
Okay.
So that is one, is there's a security benefit because usually you do different things in production,
Hmm.
non-production. The non-production may be more relaxed, but the additional benefits are like blast radius and also management. So that segmentation of the network would come alongside segmentation of your control plane and not just data plane. Right, because very often when we say network segmentation, we think data plane. So we have these different networks and they can't communicate with each other. But then if I'm managing those independently, I also have additional flexibility, because if I'm making changes to my non-production network, adding more routes or making some, management adjustments that could potentially be an
Hmm.
error, human error, if there's a human being involved, then usually that you want to have that separation not just on the data plane, but also on the control plane and management plane. So that would be the additional benefits of
Hmm.
segmentation. It's not just the data plane segmentation, but it's also the management plane segmentation that can help you with like simpler manageability or make it a little bit easier to troubleshoot. But at the same time, like creating additional segments comes with extra complexity. So that's why I said I still do see some customers that just go, I don't want to be in the business of applying my control in the network
Hmm.
environment. I'll apply control elsewhere, and we probably will chat about what are the different control options later on. But yeah, so it's not the be all and end all. Think about it as like just a layer on the onion, and make sure that you have those clear cut requirements from your risk
Yeah,
assessment.
yeah. So, so what I'm getting from your response is there is no standard formula that you apply that, hey, do it because you have to do risk compliance or just for security. There are various use cases which it can cater to, and it always depends on your own risk analysis of your, let's say, infrastructure or even your business, and then based on that, you work on the network segmentation accordingly.
Correct. Although I would say if we're talking production non-production, I would say it's a really good practice to separate those. I would even say best practice to separate your production and non-production
Yeah, yeah.
into at least separate data
Hmm.
planes. If you're really good with automation, and you have a very good control process for managing your management plane or control plane. So your changes are really validated, and there's automation and there's CI/CD pipelines. Maybe instead of a human going in and making changes, you could consider kind of having the same component from a management
Hmm.
plane, but then still have that data plane separation. I would say an example for that in AWS would be a transit gateway. So transit gateway is like a logical
Hmm.
router. Um, a distributed system, we talk about it as a kind of single object, but it's a distributed system. So it's highly available.
Hmm.
And as itself, it doesn't have any kind of quota limits because it's nature of how it's
Right.
deployed. But it so that um, I lost my train of thought for a second.
So you're talking about like transit
uh,
gateway and how it can help.
yes. So example, yes. So the transit gateway is an example of a single object, a single logical
Hmm.
construct that has multiple logical route tables that you can
Hmm.
deploy. So you're still managing a single transit gateway, but underneath you have three data
Right.
planes and three logical like VRF
Hmm.
equivalents or route tables on the transit
Hmm.
gateway. Production, non-production, development, test, however you want to split
Right.
it. So the question there is, you definitely want to split those data planes. That's a really good practice. The control plane is more of a how comfortable you are with the changes that you're making. So if you are really going crazy on the non-production environment and doing a lot of wild changes, I would keep it to the separate transit
Hmm.
gateway. So have a transit gateway for non-production environments and then transit gateway for production that the change control process is a lot more strict for than it is for non.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, yeah, thank you for highlighting that. It's a very good practice to have production and non-productions in separate segments, and uh, that is not just a best practice. It's a good practice to follow, right? um, so one question that comes to my mind is, let's say, yeah, I'm convinced that I did a risk assessment and I need to build network segmentation for security perspective, let's say. What best practices should I keep in mind when I am implementing segmentation controls?
So I would say there's two areas. So one, make sure you familiarize yourself with the technical capabilities that your environment
Hmm.
has. So, okay, what are the tools that I can use to implement my network segmentation? Right? I was telling you about Transit
Right.
Gateway. That's very specific to
Hmm.
AWS. So that's a construct that only lives on AWS. If you're going on premise, you'd be using things like
Hmm.
VRFs and maybe MPLS VPNs. So knowing what technical capabilities you have is one big part, and then the second part is kind of going back to again something we said already about like making sure that you know what your requirements are, and then map those requirements into the technical capabilities. So that's going back to that risk assessment, and then figuring out how am I splitting data. So a lot of the customers I'm working with, they're either migrating or already are on
Hmm.
AWS. So very often they already have some idea of how they're already creating different logical segments in their existing
Hmm.
environments. And so they don't really have to spend time on like what are going to be those segments. We know what segments we
Right.
need. We have a PCI environment that needs to be completely isolated. We have prod, dev, and test, or we have business units even that have to have completely separate networking segments. So then it becomes more about just mapping those to the technical capabilities in the environment that you're deploying into.
It sounds very similar to how even you will do engineering, right? Understanding the business requirements and understanding what, let's say, the framework or the language that you're using, and then mapping them so that you can build the capabilities. So very similar. You need to understand why you want to do the network segmentation, and then marry it with the right technology uh, to implement the capabilities. Now, let's say I did some network segmentation implementation. How do I ensure that there is proper enforcement of these controls and there are no misconfigurations happening as part of it?
Yeah. You would usually have to, in AWS, there's a set of tools that you can use, like AWS config or other components that would do some kind of
Hmm.
governance. So validation that the environment is working correctly. So these would be tools that would look more on the configuration side. Is the configuration done in a certain
Hmm.
way? You could also have tools that would look more of a data plane setup. So we have things like reachability analyzer that could, or network access analyzer, which are different tools ultimately that can help you figure out how your connectivity is working. So what they would do is they would look at the configuration of data plane components like route tables, security groups, components on the path, and then be able to tell you authoritatively, hey, the path is available or the path is not available.
Yeah.
So I see some customers integrate those tools into their pipelines where they're making changes to the
Hmm.
network. And then they, at the end of the change, they use that as just a QA validation to make sure that, okay, prod cannot talk to dev. We tested it. The system, reachability analyzer checked it, and the path is not available, which is what we want. And then, prod can still talk to another prod environment or to some sort of shared environment. And again, the reachability analyzer validated that, so we have a
Hmm.
proof that this path exists. So usually it comes down to like figuring out the tooling that can validate your connectivity options.
Yeah, so I have like when you highlighted reachability analyzer, like I have had like myself, I have had experience where I had set up the route table. I at least I thought I have set up the route table properly, but the traffic doesn't get routed, and you are like, what did I miss? And you go to the reachability analyzer and you run it, and then you figure out, oh, there is some setting. So even though it's a small setting, I have missed that setting. So we fix it. I fix it, and then it starts working. So yeah, definitely reachability analyzer is a great tool to look at like how the network traffic is getting routed.
Same for me. I've had similar experiences when you're like in the evening setting something up for a demo and like, why is this not working? And it always turns out that you messed up a route somewhere and you're pointing to the wrong destination and end up with asymmetric traffic. So yeah, reachability analyzer for the win
Yeah,
there.
yeah, absolutely. So now, if we increase the scale of this, right? Let's say you work with large enterprise, customers, enterprises also, where they have multiple workloads, different types of workloads, like serverless or Kubernetes or virtual machine based, and different types of patch services also they're using. In that case, when you get into a network segmentation setup, do you see it differently than how you highlighted earlier, right? Maybe based on some of the use cases, you have specific network segmentation policies that you define. When it comes to all of these complex cloud setup, do you see them differently? Any other factors that you look at?
hmm I would say it's still going to be very similar from a point of view of making sure your requirements are clear and making sure you understand the
Hmm.
technology. Some things you probably want to consider more maybe is any exceptions. So I see a lot of customers going, I will keep my prod and dev completely separate,
Hmm.
and then the next day there's some requirement that forces them to connect those. And there's ways to do it in a very secure way. Like you don't have to use a network. You have ways to expose just applications between environments. But on a network level, is just understanding like, do we need to plan for exceptions? Or are we just going to be able to say always no to any team that comes to us and says they need that communication to happen?
Hmm.
And then I would say for the larger you are, the simpler you want to keep things, right? Because I always like to say that any design that I'm reviewing and on a network design that needs to pass the 3 a.m. test, where someone can wake up at 3 a.m. to gets paged at 3 a.m. to try and support a pattern or an outage or some issue,
Hmm.
and they look at the network diagram and immediately understand what's going on. Because you can there's a lot of flexibility in the cloud and you can be as complex as possible. And I've seen customers really build complicated environments and they will work and they will provide uh, you know some value that the customer sees, but then they could end up being very complicated to manage. So in terms of creating network segmentation, I would say keep it as simple as you can.
Hmm.
Don't over-index on using network as a security function. You can do that in different places. Don't Network is a good broad brush, very wide set of rules that you deploy. And I think another example I have here is going back to that transit
Hmm.
gateway. So transit gateway can have 5,000 attachments, the VPCs and a bunch of other things, but only 20 route tables. Again, the route tables, you can imagine them as like
Yeah,
VRFs.
yeah.
Uh, and it's not because it can't have more route tables. we put the limit so low. It can be increased, but you really have to have a good use
Yeah.
case to increase the number of route tables, because we want to prevent customers from overcomplicating their
Hmm.
environment. Because I've chatted to a lot of customers that when Transgate will launch, and they're like, "Oh, perfect! I'm going to have a route table per VPC, so I can be very granular of how I'm going to control access." And you're like, "Oh no, this is not what you want to do. It's just going to become overly
Yeah.
complicated, and the route tables are not the right place to put such granular controls. Keep it simple. Sure, have your prod dev or PCI environment. Keep them separate. That makes sense. But then more granular controls should go elsewhere, not in the network."
Yeah, yeah. And I think two things that I take out of your response, right? One is simplicity, and I, I I cannot stress that enough, right? Like the example that you gave, if somebody is getting paged at 3 a.m. and they are not able to figure out what is your network setup, and they need to spend hours to figure out how you have set up that, it's not best use of their time, right? In a way. And if there is an incident going on, then it's even crazy that you're still trying to figure out what's going on. So simplicity, definitely. And the other part is like, again, getting familiar with some of these tools like reachability analysis analyzer, so that you understand how the network is set up, and at that time you're not panicking and you have a good grasp of it. And network graph, like having that, either a maybe an image or using a tool to understand the network graph would definitely help in those scenarios, right? um,
I totally agree.
so when it comes to segmentation, there are many methods. Like you have been talking about transit gateways. There are security groups, VPCs, subnets. There are many such tools available to practitioners. Which one do you pick at in which scenarios? Do you have a formula that you follow?
Yeah. So you think about the tools often as an and rather than an or. It's more of a defense in depth, and I should be using multiple
Hmm.
tools. I just need to figure out what tools are good for what use cases. So I want to start with security groups, because those are security groups is a default on. So you can't deploy a resource inside AWS that doesn't have a security
Yeah.
group. And they're pretty cool. They're like stateful firewalls that you can deploy around your network interfaces that you deploy inside of VPC or your virtual
Hmm.
machines. And they can span, it doesn't matter what subnets, what IP address your things have, they're part of the same security group, they're getting the same
Yeah.
treatment. And those security groups, they're default deny, and you can only add allow rules.
Hmm.
So that's sometimes a little bit challenging. So all you're doing is basically saying, I have a security group, by default it's denying everything, and I need to just decide what I want to allow to my thing, to my
Yeah.
resource. And you can set up rules for inbound and outbound. I typically see most customers do inbound. Outbound is a little bit more rare.
Hmm.
Um, and they scale to around 1,000 entries. So you do have to request an increase, but 1,000 entries per security group, or 1,000 entries per multiple security groups on the same network interfaces, that's really the
Yeah.
limit. So they're pretty beefy, and they're always a good starting point. So that's something that you would always have. Then network access control lists are a second tool, but it's more of an optional thing. By default, they're allow any. So they have a lot less entries. 40 entries is the maximum,
Hmm.
and they're stateless. So if you're getting too complex with your rules and you allow something one way, you then always need to remember to allow the reverse of that same flow in the opposite direction. My recommendation typically for Knuckles is to figure out any kind of broad use cases that you want to apply them for.
Hmm.
So maybe you want to deny any telnet port traffic in your
Hmm.
VPC. You can just do that easily with
Knuckles.
with a
Yeah.
knuckle. Or a set of IP address ranges that you never want to communicate with, also a knuckle. But if you have more than a few hundred IP address ranges, then again, knuckle's not going to fit because it only has 40
Yeah.
entries.
Yeah.
So knuckle, I would say optional. You really have to have a use case for a knuckle. But if you have that deny use case, or like deny any port 80, I don't want to have port 80. I just want port 443.
Hmm.
Those are good use cases for a knuckle. Both knuckles and security groups operate in layer 4,
Hmm.
right? So you can set up rules that are based on IP addresses or based on ports. So I can say deny HTTP on port 80, right? And that's going to be it. I can't really look inside of that HTTP request and say I really don't like the the URI that this request is going
Mm-hmm.
to, or even the host name. So if you do have those requirements where you need to dig deeper into the packet to make a decision on your forwarding or not
Mm-hmm.
forwarding, you need to look at kind of deep packet inspection firewalls. So we have an offering that's native. There are third-party options as well that you can bring in easily. But those usually would be the drivers. You need to look deeper into the packet, or you have a larger scale than the 1,000 entries.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's kind of more. There's also this expands if you start looking at, okay, if I'm doing ingress, maybe then I need to look at things like web application
Yeah.
firewall. So that's a different type of firewall to use. And again, that's really specialized for a particular use
Mm-hmm.
case. But again, you think about them as an and rather than an or. I would say what not to do is don't, again, and I mentioned that earlier, don't spend too much time on making the network a very granular control
Mm.
point. Even with, when we think about your boundaries, and it becomes different than what you might be used to on premise. So on premise, a subnet is your very clear
Right.
boundary, or effectively a network
Right.
segment. And if to get between two different subnets on premise, you need to have a router. You need to explicitly allow that traffic. Maybe you have a firewall. So that's a good control
Right.
point. Inside a VPC, subnets are just like containers. Like they can contain contain a set of IP addresses that you will put. So I shouldn't have said containers, because that might be confusing, because containers also mean something
Right.
else. But they're like a storage place for resources. So you can pull IP addresses out of that
Mm-hmm.
subnet. But inside of VPC, there's an implicit kind of router.
Yeah.
So any subnets can talk to any other subnet. So from a routing perspective, inside of VPC, everything can talk to everything. It's more like a layer 2
Mm-hmm.
network than it is as layer 3, even though layer 2 doesn't exist inside of VPC. You don't really need to deal with that. Anything can talk to anything.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't really use subnets as your boundaries unless you're using knuckles. Then you should think more of a VPC as your broader boundary
Okay.
for, like, from a segmentation point
Mm-hmm.
of view. Inside the VPC, you might have a subnet that has a route to the internet and another subnet that doesn't have
Yeah.
a route to the internet. So you're just basically splitting maybe your public facing and your non-public facing
Mm-hmm.
resources. But usually, what I recommend is, if customers have, okay, this is going to be my production or a particular, security level, think about a VPC as the broader boundary rather than individual subnets in that VPC. Because when you're getting traffic out of that VPC, say to the transit gateway or to Cloud One or to another networking construct that supports segmentation, you will not be able to get to that subnet granularity. All traffic is treated as a whole
Right.
VPC. So when you're making those segmentation decisions, think about the VPC as that container for your certain segment or certain security level.
Yeah, makes sense. So one of the things that you highlighted, right, like in security groups, it's default deny, which sometimes we don't realize that, and especially for someone, let's say, who is coming from on-prem world to the cloud world, it takes a little bit of time to understand the network intricacies, right? But as you highlighted, like with security groups, NACLs, VPCs, subnets, there are so many bells and whistles, but at the same time you should not go overboard and do very granular configuration. I mean, that's the message that I'm getting. It should be
For,
very.
yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, sorry. For security groups, you can be granular, but the DACLs and subnets, the granularity decreases. So they're like broad brush
Hmm.
settings. But if you're using security groups, or if you're using a next generation firewall, or something that does deep packet inspection, that's where you kick in your granularity.
Okay.
That's where you can have, like, I'm allowing this IP address to this port. So there's place and time for granularity, and there's knuckles and subnets and route tables
Hmm.
are a good broad brush tools, but not very good for, like, super granular rules, because it's going to get very complicated.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for correcting me. So yeah, it makes sense because the more granularity you add, sometimes it helps you, but it has to be at the right place, right? If you add it at a subnet level or something like that, you again, it goes back to what you said, right? Like if somebody gets paged at 3 a.m., will they be able to understand what exactly is being set up?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it will become a nightmare. So
Although, just to add before we jump
sure.
off, there is a so you can't always decide the level of granularity for your security controls. That's sometimes driven by your risk
Mm-hmm.
assessment. So you're more of a we have a policy that we only allow a granular access to specific host names, right? That might be the policy that my security team is giving
Hmm.
me. So then I need to find a technical solution for me to be able to apply that level of granularity. And that's not going to be something I'll be doing on a network level. That's going to be something I'll be doing on like deep packet inspection
Yeah,
firewall.
yeah, makes sense. So, yeah, absolutely. Um, uh, while responding to the earlier question, you touched on containers. Of course, you didn't mean the containers as in Kubernetes containers. So now a lot of workload is moving to Kubernetes or even containers like non-Kubernetes distributions. And within Kubernetes there is own like traffic routing and network routing and everything. It's at a different crazy level. So do you, when you work with customers who have implemented Kubernetes or you are using, let's say, ECS or something like that, do you look at network segmentation differently? Do you do different setup in that case?
Yeah, it changes things a little bit. Well, the way Kubernetes is deployed inside AWS, there's a container network interface CNI that allows the containers to have an IP
Mm-hmm.
address from the VPC range. So effectively, a container becomes a first-class citizen inside a VPC.
Mm.
It's just another virtualization layer on top of the existing virtualization layer because now it's a container on a virtual machine that lives on a virtual private cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing that the VPC will not see is communication within the cluster that happens on the same worker node,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you took two containers on the same worker node and there's some communication happening between those, the VPC networking things will not see it. So if you're running flow logs, if you're trying to apply some security controls using security groups, these things will not kick in because the traffic is not leaving the worker
Mm.
node.
Yeah.
If the traffic is going to something else inside of VPC, we now give you options to set up security groups for your pods if that's what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then you use those security groups to be referenced on, I don't know, another service inside that VPC. So you can set up those capabilities. But if you want to have additional controls inside of your Kubernetes cluster, you need to use Kubernetes native constructs like network policies, for example, to control like communication between different services, namespaces, and so on.
Right. Yeah, because it has like service accounts, you have roles and policies within Kubernetes, which gives you more granular control. But I like one thing that you highlighted, right? If there are two containers which are running in the same node, then you do not see that communication outside as in at a VPC flow log level, which is a key thing to remember, right? Sometimes we, since we have done the setup of the VPCs and all of that, we might assume that we'll see that traffic as well at the VPC level, but that's not how it works. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah.
um
That's going to be usually that's not going to be a huge percentage of your traffic because if you have a larger cluster, the chances of you leaving the worker node to talk to another service on another worker node are pretty
yeah,
high. But it could be cases where you will be staying on the same worker node. So you're totally right.
yeah, yeah. uh, so one of the terms that like is floating around network segmentation is like zero trust, right? A lot of folks talk about network as one of the key aspects of zero trust. How do you incorporate like network segmentation principles so that you can achieve a zero trust architecture,
Yeah.
let's say?
So zero trust is such a broad topic, and I know we probably don't have too much time to really explore all of
Hmm.
it. But on a high level, we think about zero trust as like the set of tools and capabilities to help you be more granular with your controls. So, and we think about it as, zero trust goes beyond just the traditional network layer
Hmm.
controls, so like the IP addresses and
Hmm.
ports, but it doesn't get rid of them. So it's more of a build on top
Hmm.
of the existing capabilities rather than replace them. And it usually is about enhancing this network level set of information that you might use to control traffic with some additional information like identity of the remote user if it's a user to application communication, or some additional identity of the application if it's application to application. We have launched a couple of services recently that kind of fall into those
Hmm.
categories. For user to app, there's a service called verified access that is allowing you to integrate with an identity provider to then decide if you want to allow a remote client to communicate with a particular application. So it's specifically kind of a replacement for maybe remote access
Mm-hmm.
VPNs. And then we also have VPC Lattice, which is more of an application layer 7 proxy, which is specifically designed to help you with app-to-app communication, regardless of what environment those apps live on. So they could be, one can be on containers, the other one could be a Lambda app, the other
Interesting.
one could be on EC2. Uh, they just talk to Lattice, and then Lattice is a L7 proxy aware of all the other applications that were registered with it, and then helps you with allowing communication from an app to app. So you don't need things like load balancers or transit gateways. It just takes care of all of the
Mm-hmm.
networking, but also allows you to add additional context in that communication. So you can use identity and access management information to decide if you want to allow traffic between two different applications in your environment. So it's kind of an interesting shift to kind of abstract a little bit more of the
Mm-hmm.
network from application to application communication. And I think that's kind of the principles of zero trust as well, because we want to slowly move away from just using the IP addresses and ports and go into something that gives us more insight into what is actually going on, and then apply controls on that.
Mm. VPC lattice definitely sounds like powerful, especially with the context, right? That sort of helps you with authentication, authorization, or even you can apply custom logic on top of it. So yeah, we'll definitely check that out. Uh,
That's correct. Yeah, and uh, it's interesting because often customers use today to make that work and to authenticate up to an app. Usually they use
mhm.
MTLS, right? Mutual TLS. So they have to manage all the certificates, deploy the
Right.
certificates on the clients, and then that's the most common way I've seen to validate the clients and allow them to talk to the
Hmm.
apps. So with Lattice, you no longer have to do any of that. You just make sure that you have the right IAM credentials from the client, and they get presented to Lattice. And then you have a policy on Lattice saying, "Hey, I only want to allow requests from my organization, or
Yeah.
from this particular role, or from this particular user." So all the IAM capabilities, IAM rules that you had, you can now bring them into the data plane to control access between your resources.
Yeah. That sounds very powerful for sure. So now shifting to security appliances. So when it comes to setting up the network infrastructure, there are several security appliances which come into play, right? Like firewalls, we have been talking about it, or different like transit gateways and stuff like that. Um, can you give us some examples of common security appliances that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, either knowingly or unknowingly?
I think the security appliances that are most common that I've seen are firewalls. So that is truly the most common thing that pops up.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about network connectivity, very rarely firewalls don't come up. It's pretty much every conversation I have about, hey, I have this two regions, I want to connect them, and I want these VPCs to talk to one another. And then usually I have these different segments.
Mm-hmm.
Then we talk about things like Transit Gateway or Cloud One to set up connectivity, but then immediately a conversation moves on to, okay, now how I apply firewalling between these different things.
Yeah.
So usually it's about firewalls, and we have options. We have this on native firewalls, whether they're like AWS Network Firewall, AWS WAF, but we also have options to bring in third-party partner firewalls
Mm-hmm.
into AWS in a very easy fashion. So it used to be pretty hard.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that if you deployed, say, Palo Alto inside AWS,
Mm-hmm.
the way you would use that Palo Alto firewall is you would send traffic to it using a route in the route table. Unfortunately, routes in the route tables in the VPC are not aware of the health of the destination. So if that firewall went down, and it's a single instance, so chances are it eventually will,
Mm-hmm.
the route would just be dropping traffic because the next hop is not available, and there's no native automation to flip that route. So that used to be pretty
Mm-hmm.
challenging. We've launched a service called Gateway Load Balancer.
Mm-hmm.
It's specifically a tool that allows you to be a destination for a route,
Mm-hmm.
but behind it, you can deploy multiple firewalls.
Ah.
So now if one of those firewalls fails, Gateway Load Balancer is still the target for your routing, so receives all the traffic, but then it knows, oh, the firewall that I'm normally sending traffic to is now down. I will use another
Mm-hmm.
one. So it helps with that availability challenge and also with scale, right? Previously, again, with the VPC routing, you can only have one
Yeah.
destination. So if you're running out of capacity on the one firewall, it's very hard to add a second firewall. You'd have to figure out like some
Yeah. Yeah.
mechanism to split your destinations based on
Mm-hmm.
routes. So with gateway load balancer, you can keep adding additional firewalls and just have them horizontally scale to handle your traffic load. So even the network firewall, so it's a native solution, uses the same thing under the hood. It's also using gateway load balancer. It's just you don't see it. It's managed by
Yeah. Yeah.
AWS, but ultimately that's what powers all of the or a lot of the security solutions. So I would say firewalls is the primary that I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing. There are some solutions for network monitoring. So, like traffic mirroring, especially, is a feature that we have that allows you to effectively create a network tap to copy any raw packets from a particular interface belonging to an EC2
Mm-hmm.
instance to a specific destination. So I've seen different types of vendors deploy their solutions behind either network load balancer or gateway load balancer, which could be a destination for that mirror
Mm-hmm.
traffic, and then they do some analysis with it to see what's going on.
Interesting. So now you highlighted like both you can use a native firewall or an external like third party firewall, right? So what factor what parameters do you use to decide that whether I should use native or third party? Is it more of a customer's decision that they have bought a solution they want to integrate, or there are any parameters which play into that decision
Yeah,
making?
that's a good question. So I would say it's very much a customer's decision,
Okay.
and the way we develop functionality and features is all about based on giving customers a choice. And usually, what starts with like a partner solution, customers come to us and say, actually, can you guys develop something because we want it managed? And then we listen to our customers, we build a solution, and then we have an additional option for customers to decide that, okay, I don't want to manage my own firewalls. I want AWS to do all the management for me. I don't want to deal with patching, with setting up a gateway load
Hmm.
balancer. I just want to set up rules and have a policy deployed in a control
Hmm.
point. So it really what I see is often customers who are already familiar with a particular solution. So say they run Checkpoint, Fortinet, Valtex, Palo Alto, whatever is the solution they have on
Hmm.
premise. They often like to bring that into AWS as well because they already have teams familiar with it. They
Yeah.
have tooling. They know the
Yeah.
monitoring. Um, so they like to keep that when they deploy inside AWS. But then there's a lot of customers who are like, okay, I just want to have it managed. I'm going to use the native network
Yeah.
firewall.
Makes
Um,
sense. So it
but
all it's mostly driven by customers, depending on what type of setup they have today, and they want to sort of connect with AWS. So in that case, they are using a third party solution. Or if somebody is more like a greenfield or starting with AWS, it makes sense to use the managed offering. And like depending on other infrastructure that you have, you might want to look at third party solutions. But native managed solutions also cover a lot of areas.
correct. There's also an aspect of, is there a specific type of functionality you're using on your current
Hmm.
vendor? Like, Palo Alto's App ID, right? There's a specific piece of functionality to Palo Alto that doesn't exist in network firewall
Right.
today. So, if you have specific requirements, it makes sense to kind of review of what am I actually using with my current vendor. If I'm deciding to go into the managed solution, are those capabilities also
Hmm.
supported? How is that? How is management going to be different? So reviewing those things when you're making that decision. So it's pretty standard. It's similar to probably like what people are used to doing on premise, where they were deciding on one firewall vendor over the other. They would just look at capabilities, how it's monitored, what the cost is going to be, how much they have to manage, things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So one final question that I have is like with COVID and all, there is an explosion of remote work and all, right? So now let's say you have your network segmentation and everything set up. Now some developer is working from a remote location, wants access. What type of remote access solutions do you see being used by customers? Which of course doesn't mean that you are adding exceptions, but how like what remote solutions do you generally see, and how do they work with the network segmentation overall?
Yeah. So the common pattern that's kind of probably still the broadest is remote access VPNs or client VPNs or remote VPNs are probably different names where you have a user somewhere on the internet, they have a client that client connects to some
Hmm.
endpoint, in AWS. So we have a managed version of that. So we have a client service called Client
Mm-hmm.
VPN, where you set up again, and again, it comes down to how much of this thing you want to manage. With Client VPN, you just set up an endpoint, it's managed, and then you have your remote users connect to that Client VPN endpoint, and they get network level access to resources inside
Mm-hmm.
AWS. And you land inside a VPC. So then, whatever connectivity that VPC has will also be provided to your users.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was saying it makes sense to think about your segmentation on a VPC level, because that's the container that you're going to be thinking about in terms of where is that VPC allowed. Because then you're bringing remote users into that VPC, um, they'll inherit whatever access that VPC has on a
Right.
broader scale.
Right.
So if that VPC is a production VPC, they have access to production. Um, so yeah, there's an option with a managed solution. There's also option with third-party partners who can deploy virtual machines inside AWS to terminate the VPNs on.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much similar principles. It'll land in a particular VPC and then inherit the behavior of that VPC to get into other resources.
Yeah.
Um, there is the landscape is evolving a little bit, right? We're there's a lot of appetite I've seen from customers to try and narrow down the access. So even though those VPN solutions often do rely on some additional user parameters, so maybe a membership to a particular group allows you access to a particular IP address,
Mm-hmm.
but with VPN solutions, very often it's still all about the network level
Yeah.
access. So it's still deciding based on an IP address, where in reality, there's a bit of a push towards uh, having some additional information to make that decision and not do it just based on an IP address.
And I think that's where there are many new tools coming up, right, around zero trust network access, where you can define more granular policy driven access rather than just IP based access.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the user to application use case where the solutions there. AWS Verified Access is one of them, where you can just use a browser
Mm-hmm.
to connect to a web application inside AWS and be authenticated against your identity provider like Okta, Ping1, whoever you're using, as long as they support OAuth. Yeah, you can, and then attributes in your identity. So maybe what group you're part of, or what color you like, whatever attributes you want to select. These could be taken into account when the decision is being made if the user should be allowed to a particular backend application.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then this can be expanded to also like awareness of your device. Is your device aligning with the policy? Does it have enough, is the antivirus up to date, or are you, anything else
Encryption
suspicious
is
on
in
your
place or
device?
not? Yeah. Stuff like that.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So then we integrate with like CrowdStrike or Jamf to provide us that information, because they're already running on the end user
Mm-hmm.
machine, and they're able to give us additional details about the security level of that machine. And if it's below a certain threshold, we might not allow the user, or the administrator can decide not to allow that user to connect to the
Yeah.
application.
Yeah.
So it becomes very powerful. I really like the zero trust
Mm-hmm.
direction, because it really makes a lot of difference in how you're really making that decision. And it's you have a lot more information to play with than just someone's username and password, group membership, and then just an IP
True,
address.
true. It gives you that power of granularity in a way, right? Based on many factors. Um, so yeah, makes sense. So that's a good way to end the security question section. Thanks, Tom, for the insightful conversation. Here are a few points that stood out for me. The first one is, before working on network segmentation, perform a risk assessment of your business and infrastructure. Depending on the use cases, whether it's for compliance or security or management, build your network segmentation. The second one is, network segmentation should be performed more at a broader level rather than very granular. This would become very difficult to operate and maintain if it is very granular. The last one is, security tools are and not an or in AWS. Like depending on the use cases, leverage the right security tools and appliances like security groups or NACLs or subnets, transit gateways or firewalls and others. Thank you. Let's go to the next section, which focuses on security practices. The way it works is, I'll highlight a security practice. You need to rate the between 1 to 5, 5 being the best, and you can add context why you have given a particular rating. So let's start with the first one. Conduct periodic security audits to identify vulnerabilities, threats, and weaknesses in your systems and applications.
Yeah, I would say this is high on my list, and I'm curious to see the practices because I imagine they're all going to be highly scored. I would even expand it to add testing of your availability, and I know availability falls a little bit under
Hmm.
security, right? The whole CIA triad. So not just think about security, but also availability. How do you deal with disaster? How do you deal with outages? These are things that I see a lot of customers being reluctant to test because it's hard to test, right? You have to schedule outages, you have to schedule
Yeah.
downtime in case something goes wrong. So it's a lot of
Hmm.
work, but it's really worthwhile doing if you're in a pickle and something really
Yeah.
happens and you have practiced it and you know your failover scenarios work and your DR
Hmm.
works. It yeah
No, agreed,
makes
agreed,
makes life a lot different.
agreed on that. Uh, the second one is use strong passwords that contain a mix of uppercase, lowercase, character, letters, numbers, symbols, and also change it frequently.
Yeah, I would say combine that with MFA as well.
Hmm.
Again, both are fives in my mind. 5 5. I don't know how if I would score one higher than the other. Combine that with MFA. This is actually some of the base recommendations when you're setting up your AWS account to strong passwords, set up MFA. Those are just kind of bread and butter things to do.
Yeah, I agree. Like MFA is now like a default recommendation that you cannot have account set up without MFA. Um, so the last one is continuous integration is a must for DevOps practices, and security architecture review should be conducted as part of it.
Totally. The sooner in your pipeline you can get into the security review, the easier your life is going to be later on. I've seen some customers where security is an afterthought,
Hmm.
and development pipeline goes through, and then security teams goes, oh no, this can't go out. There's a security flaw in it, and it creates a lot of friction. So if you can get your security team involved very early,
Hmm.
into your development process, that makes a lot of difference because they feel like they're part of the process and they're just supporting the development rather than everybody sees security. And I've been in that place when I was on this network security team, and we were just doing reviews and saying no to people when they came in with like things that they already developed. So it would have been nice at the time to be involved earlier in the cycle, so we can be part of the development journey. So to me, that would be a 5 as well. I really it's really hard to rate these
Hmm.
because I would say like you got to do all of them really.
No, I understand. And there is always that friction between security and engineering or even DevOps, right? So I can relate to what you're saying. Um, so before I let you go, one last question is around any recommendation that you have, a blog or a book or a podcast, anything.
Yeah, I would. So I'm a little bit biased. So I would recommend to people catching up on the networking and content delivery blog, which I help manage, and we have a lot of contributions from folks inside AWS. So it's an interesting resource to stay on top of. Privately, I like there's a Darknet Diaries podcast. I think it's Jack Resider.
Hmm.
I always find it super interesting. He talks. It's not just about the technical. He talks a lot about like hacking, but a lot of it is around social engineering. So it's very interesting to hear how these social engineering scams are happening. And yeah, it's always really fun to listen. He does a really good job investigating and getting a lot of data and getting really good guests to talk about what happens.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I highly recommend it.
Dark Knight Diaries, like I have watched a few episodes, and the way it's presented is also more story-like, right? Rather than it's a discussion, it's more story-like, so you can grasp that in a much better manner. So
Yeah.
yeah.
There was a recent one, I think, on the cyber cryptocurrency scams,
Hmm.
and it was kind of interesting because one of the victims was someone who works in security in tech, and they were actually quite cautious about the. And it's super interesting to hear how that social engineering really. It was really hard for that person to really pick up on it
Hmm.
because it was done so well.
Hmm.
Yeah, fascinating. Like the human psychology, like you think it's going to be all about like technical skills and hacking, but in reality, it's all about social engineering.
Yeah. And so what we will do is when we publish the episode, we'll tag both the darknet diaries and the network and content delivery blog post, so that our audience can also go there and subscribe and start following that as well.
Awesome. Perfect.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Tom, for coming and sharing your knowledge and your insights with us. It was lovely to have you in the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Pur.
Yeah. And to our audience, thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.